Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Brent, joined by my co-host, Ann-Margaret.
Hi.
On today's episode, we have Bryan Anderson, our Data Management Director. Hi, Bryan.
Hi, how's it going?
Pretty good. Data management is part of our Aquifer Management Division. Is that right, Bryan?
Yes, that's correct. Newly created division when I started here back in July 2019.
So today, you may have guessed, we're going to be talking all about data and how it's stored and why it's important.
So, Bryan, we know water monitoring is a vital part of the work we do at the EAA to manage, enhance, and protect the aquifer. And this month, World Water Monitoring Day was celebrated on Saturday, September 18th, which is a day to raise public awareness and involvement in protecting water resources around the world. Can you give a brief overview of your job and the importance of monitoring the aquifer?
Sure thing. Well, thanks for having me. I think this is a really important topic, and I'm glad you guys brought me in to talk about this. So again, I'm Bryan Anderson. I've been with the Edwards Aquifer Authority for just a little over a year now, and came in as Director of Data Management. So basically the Data Management Department, we deal in the collection of any kind of environmental data. So think of observational data like water levels, rain gauges, weather stations, surface water data. We currently have 151 active monitoring sites where we're actually collecting data from those sites. We've got over 70 groundwater wells, 58 rain gauges, 16 weather stations, and 7 stream sites as part of our Habitat Conservation Plan program to collect data for them. And what kind of separates our data management department from other agencies, we look at what we call kind of continuous data. So while we do collect some one-off or quarterly water level measurements, we're really focused on the continuous data, what we call time series data. So 15-minute interval data, 5-minute interval data, and so we can get a really long continuous data set. We can look at not only seasonal variation, but also diurnal differentiation in the data, which can be pretty cool to look at. So our area has pretty much 3 different sections. The first thing we do is we collect the data. So data collection, we've got a crew that goes out and monitors the equipment that's deployed out in the field, calibrates that equipment, ensures that everything's functioning properly. Then the next step is data processing. So once the data are transmitted over either a cellular data plan, or we go out and actually download the data, we process the data, make sure that there's no gaps, make sure that everything looks correct, do some quality control, quality assurance on the data, and then last we try and get it out, right? We disseminate the data. Right on our website, you've got your index wells, you've got some springs data, and then of course we've got our weather station data, which is and rain gauge data, which is fairly new, I think, to the Edwards Aquifer Authority. We're getting that data out on different platforms as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell how what kind of differentiates us from other areas of the agency that are collecting data.
So, Bryan, your group is also in charge of monitoring our index wells and posting that data on our website. And our city, perhaps more than any other, is aware of these levels as they're on the weather reports, they're on the news. People hear about our index well called J17 here in San Antonio, and they're aware that level represents the level of the aquifer. But I don't think they understand, what it really means and where those data originate. So could you explain that for us a little bit, how the data are collected and how these index wells work, and also the spring indices?
Yeah, definitely. So, part of those 70 groundwater wells we monitor are the 2 index wells, J17 here in San Antonio and J27 down in Uvalde. So the basic nuts and bolts of those is we're getting 15-minute interval data on what we call the depth of water, right? Basically the distance between the top of the land surface and the top of the water in the well. And then, of course, we convert that into the water level elevation data that we supply on our website so that you can kind of compare against other wells and data points in the area. So our basic setup for those index wells are we use what's called pressure transducers. And so those pressure transducers are actually submerged in the water column in the well, and they'll read the pressure, the head pressure that's sitting on top of that transducer. There's some calculation that goes on, and we can get the amount of water that's sitting above that transducer. Some more calculations there, and you can actually get that depth of water from land surface. And so that data is then transmitted to a data logger, and then that data logger transmits that data to our servers here at EAA, so we can actually see it in pretty much real time. Pretty much about 5 minutes after the 15-minute mark, we've got that water level measurement in our system. Now, since these are index wells and they're very high priority to make sure that we get everything right, we actually have 2 other backup instruments in those index wells.
Oh, okay.
We have one that's actually transmitting in tandem with our primary pressure transducer, so that way we can kind of make sure that there's no difference. We've actually got a calculation so we can see, okay, are they drifting apart from each other? If there's too big of a difference between the 2 sensors that are coming in, we know that there's a problem with one of the instrumentation. We can go out and resolve that issue. We've got even our fail-safe among all fail-safes. We have another instrument pressure transducer down the hole that's collecting data on its own with a battery backup. So worst case scenario, we have a power failure or some kind of problem with the other instrumentation. We can at least go, and it might not be real time, but we can go and we can grab that data and get it into our system as soon as possible. So we like to have no gaps in our index wells. Now, I always tell our staff gaps happen, and that's just part of the process of collecting this type of data. But we want to make sure with our index wells that we have a full picture, because it is so important to how we manage the aquifer.
Wow, Bryan. So I remember years ago there was also a recorder at J17 that looked like a seismograph. It was a needle that would move up and down based on the water levels changing in the aquifer. And if there was a large earthquake, even on this continent, it would detect it in the aquifer.
Oh, yeah.
And it would show up on that graph.
Yeah, that's the one instance where the advancements in technology kind of fail us a little bit on that, is because those old chart recorders that Brent was mentioning were really cool. Yeah, you could see it in real time and to the nanosecond, pretty much. And they were great. That was kind of the first technology to really get this continuous data set going. Of course, you can tell the time intensity on that, on translating that long rolled sheet of paper with lines on it. It was very time intensive, but that was actually, even without the chart recorders, we're actually able to detect some of those events. Just back end of July, I think it was July 29th, there was an 8.2 magnitude earthquake up off the coast of Alaska around midnight or so our time. And by about 12:45 a.m., you could actually see a little jump in some of the water levels, not only in J17, but in the City of Hondo well and several other of our wells that we monitor in the Edwards. You can kind of see that little jump up in the water level around that time. So it's pretty interesting when you kind of correlate all this data, and you can see how it is connected, not just the hydrologic cycle here, but an earthquake thousands of miles away.
We had a reporter actually reach out to us for that information, and I think he referenced the time before that with the other earthquake.
Yeah, I remember it picked up the earthquakes from Japan, the Fukushima disaster. Those were on there. It just speaks to how powerful earthquakes are and how interconnected our geology is, and how the water, sloshes around in there when the earth shakes.
So when you were talking about this roll of paper that was like the seismograph thing, so that's how it used to be collected?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it started out with back in the early or the late 1800s on horseback. Staff from the U.S. Geological Survey would ride around.
Wait, really?
Ride around horseback. I've got there's old sketches that I saw in the state archives of USGS personnel on horseback they had the trusty old steel tape, which is still to this day a staple of the groundwater monitors toolkit. Just basically a long roll of steel tape with graduation marks on it. And so it kind of progressed from just doing that, which again we still use as our primary calibration tool, and then it moved on, to electric probes, little beep at you when it hits water, and then on to when we started moving towards the continuous data set, when we realized, okay, we can. It's neat to get these one-off measurements, every year, every quarter, every season, whatever. But when we started looking at, we really want to see how that aquifer changes within the year, through the seasons, and like I said, even between night and day. And so that's when those chart recorders started coming on, and it was a pretty cool setup. The state actually has several of these types of wells still set up with what's called the float and weight. So at the top of the well, you'd have a little kind of pulley system at the top with a line going across it. One side had a float, one side had a weight, and basically it would just kind of, as it goes up and down, that wheel would move, and that would move the needle, and so you kind of have that real time. As we, as I mentioned before, with the issue of trying to transcribe those scrolls of paper and get them into a database, they actually started having digital loggers that would, know at a certain point in time, okay, it's 12:30. What is the measurement that's coming in on the float and weight right now? And then it would log that measurement. And so you can get down to as fine as 1 minute intervals on some of these sites. So I know when we're doing pump tests or other kinds of deep analysis on certain wells, we could tighten it down to where we're getting 1 minute increment data. Of course, that can really balloon over time. So we've figured out through trial and error that the 15-minute interval is pretty good
like
for
the sweet spot for
yeah, exactly. You're getting enough data coming in, but you're not dealing with so much having to maintain.
That's what I was going to say. Is back in the day, storing one measurement from one well a day probably wasn't too bad, but now you have all these wells across the region recording at 15-minute intervals. It must be a challenge to store and maintain all that data.
It's definitely a challenge over the years. It's gotten obviously a lot easier now with cloud storage and just the fact that you can get terabytes and gigabytes and Google bytes and whatever kind of bytes of storage nowadays for fairly cheap. But yeah, it's a lot, and that's what kind of comes in. You can collect and collect and collect and collect all to your heart's content. But, when you start getting to these volumes of data, you really have to have a workflow in place to manage, that data, to make sure, first of all, that it's coming in and that it's correct and that it's true and that there's nothing wrong with the data. And then you have to make sure that it's stored properly, that you don't lose it, that you can access it easily. And then on top of that, it's not just there to look at and look pretty. You want to be able to analyze the data. You want to be able to compare it to different data sets. And right now that's kind of the big push, not only here in Texas, but globally, is to try and get a kind of like standardization for not only groundwater data, but just water data in general. There's a big push to the state and national, the One Water data approach, trying to get it together so that you can compare across GCD boundaries, across state boundaries. The Texas Water Development Board maintains a state database. We feed our data into that state database, and in turn, the Texas Water Development Board feeds their data into the USGS database. And so you kind of have this tiered system of kind of pushing data up so that it's available for anybody that needs it.
That's really neat.
So I know we talked about J17 and J27 and then the Comal and San Marcos Springs. Can you let us know, and I know it has to do with critical period management essentially as it pertains to that type of data, but that's ultimately what that information is used for, correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's the primary use. Now, to speak on the springs, the Comal and the San Marcos Springs have been maintained by the U.S. Geological Survey. And so we rely heavily on the U.S. Geological Survey to provide us the spring flow data for Comal and San Marcos Springs. And so that's kind of the one part of the critical period management data collection that we do kind of farm out to the U.S. Geological Survey. And, of course, we're in close contact with them to ensure that the data looks true and correct and that we feed it out to the public at proper times. And so, as not only is it for regulation, the J17 in the index wells and the springs, but it's got a whole host of, everybody, has some sort of stake in seeing that data. I know just as a tuber, it's good to know if you're tubing the Comal or San Marcos, what's the spring flows at, what's the stream flows at, and so our fishermen, just any kind of recreation along those rivers, it's good to know. And then obviously with J17, it's not just for industrial or municipal, making sure that there's enough water in the aquifer, but also just for the regular well owner out there that's using the Edwards Aquifer to know, okay, well, what's the aquifer like? Oh, maybe I need to check my well. If J17 is going down, maybe my level is going down too, and I need to make sure that my pump, is still below the water level. So, beyond even just regulation, just understanding the aquifer, the sheer amount of data that we can collect always feeds into those types of research not only policy making, but research and analysis and the modeling. The more data, the more data points we can get. I know that's modelers are always wanting more and more data to fill in their grids. And so, that's part of our charge too, is to help fill in those gaps, those data gaps. Like I said, when I worked for the state, you had a large territory, and so you kind of had to pick and choose where you could collect. We get down into the groundwater conservation district region. We've got a little bit more control. We know a little bit more of the landowners. We can search a little bit better to fill in some of those gaps, and so that's kind of part of our charge too, is to collect as much data as we possibly can, because you never know when you're going to need it. I know everybody looks at, the levels are going down, we need to collect data. Well, even in times of abundance, we still want to have that data. Having that background data is vital, not just when, there's an event happening.
I see. So data has been collected since the EAA began operations, correct? And does it date back to even before? I know you just mentioned the horseback riders at USGS. I'm assuming it did, right? Like the EUWD and. Oh yeah,
and I was actually just looking at this before coming in to record this. So J17 has been constantly collecting data since 1932. The U.S. Geological Survey began measuring that well back when it was owned by the U.S. government, basically when the fort was actually started, and so. Over time, there's been USGS has been the primary collector of that data, but then the state came in and collected data at J17 for a while. And there's even, I was looking at the state records, and it shows that a groundwater conservation district was measuring the well way back in 1983. And so it's very possible that even before the UWD. Was in existence, that somebody as part of a groundwater conservation district entity was collecting data at J17, and then of course now EAA has taken over full control of collecting data there. But even J27 back in 1940, the USGS was collecting data there, and Comal Springs goes even farther back. 1927 were the first spring flow measurements from Comal Springs. San Marcos is the young buck of the group, 1956. So the drought hit. Believe San Marcos Springs never went dry during the drought, but when I'm assuming that 1956 date was right around the time that Comal Springs went dry and realized, okay, we better start looking at San Marcos Springs too. And so the data record for San Marcos Springs starts about 1956. But so USGS was kind of the impetus of the beginning of collecting of this data. And then obviously as the EAA came along, water levels are generally the what we call the lowest hanging fruit of data collection for a groundwater conservation district. And so that's generally the first program that kind of starts up, is collecting groundwater levels. And then, as I kind of came onto the EAA, I was really excited to see that the EAA was starting to collect not only the groundwater data, but also the climate data, the meteorological data, the weather stations, the rain gauges, and even the surface water quality streams with the HCP program. Kind of showing that groundwater. It's great to have our head in the sand and look at groundwater. We need to do that, but at the same time, we can't escape from the fact that it's part of the hydrologic cycle. We need to collect data on not just the water that's in the ground, but the water that's recharging that water in the ground. And so especially in the Edwards region, I think it's very important not to just kind of keep our head in the rock here. Don't say head in the rocks to look at groundwater, but it's really neat being able to look at the entire hydrologic cycle in the region. So I'm really excited about that and continuing to add to that scientific knowledge. So
you kind of touched on it a minute ago, but how has data collection at the EAA changed since you've been here over time?
Yeah, so that's kind of the great thing about it. It's like I kind of said before, it starts just kind of with manual measurements, and you're just kind of collecting the data as you can, as you have time, if you have personnel. And then as technology has kind of increased, not only other people with the EAA, we've been able to bring in these real-time continuous measurements. Like I said, it started with just being able to on-site collect that continuous data, store it on a computer or a hard drive on the location. Field staff would go out, download that data, bring it back to the office, upload it, graph it, make sure everything looks good, and so that was a great technological step. But of course, the caveat to that is you don't know what the data looks like until you actually bring it back. And if it's been 6 months since you've been out there to download it and the battery failed the day after, well, you've got only 5 months of no data
Happened all
coming
the time.
in. Oh yeah,
happened all the time.
Oh yeah, it still does.
Wow.
But and so that's where we moved to the what we call the telemeter sites, telemetry, which is basically just a fancy word for saying you're transmitting the data over the air, either through satellite or through cellular data plans. And so we currently have. Don't have the proper count with me right now, about 13 wells that are on that telemetry. And so,
Nice.
as I said before, we get those 15-minute measurements. Well, we're able to see in real time when that data is coming in. So if there is a failure at the well side, the battery goes dead, or all of a sudden the transducer stops recording, then we get notified within within the hour when that instrumentation is down. So we can deploy our staff fairly quickly to go make sure that we don't have that loss of data. So that's kind of one of our big push right now is to get as many of our continuous non-telemetry sites up on telemetry. So that way we can have a better sense of the data and how it's coming in, and ensure that we're not having as many, even though gaps happen. We want to mitigate the number of gaps that are in the data set and make sure that we can keep as much of that data as possible. So it's progressed over the years, but again, I keep coming back to that steel tape. It's still, you can collect all that data and telemetry. You still have to have somebody go out and make sure that the instrumentation is functioning properly, and 9 times out of 10 it's a steel tape or it's an electric line that's actually touching the water to make sure that the data are coming true and collect.
So what you're saying is we still need the people out in the field collecting that information to ensure, like the QA/QC stuff that you talked about earlier.
Oh yes, we can make it more efficient, by having this telemetry, so that we can get automatically notified when there's data points. But it's always going to need that human touch to be able to go out there and just kind of make sure things are still working. So you can set them up and let them go for a while, but you got to keep going back to it to make sure that stuff's working properly.
Wow, Bryan, I think you really highlighted just how important these data are. I mean, if we look at our models, which help us predict how the springs are going to react to future weather events and future climate, these models are only as good as the data we put in them. So the more data we have, the more accurate they're going to be. And the critical period management that we talked about, that speaks to the delicate balance that we have with our aquifer and with the system. We need to know how much recharge is coming in, how much water is available in the aquifer for permitted use, and how much water is discharging at the springs where we have our threatened and endangered species. We've had a lot of episodes, I think, about the species, and they depend on that spring flow. And so it's critical that we get the data about how much water is coming out of the springs, how much water, or what the pressure is at J17. It all works together to make this system work. We have 2 million people depending on the aquifer. We have endangered species at the springs, and the data help us balance those two uses.
Yeah, it's the foundation of everything. Without this continuous kind of background environmental data collection, your policymakers aren't informed. Your scientists are limited in their capacity to do research, and so it's a vital part, and it's kind of the foundation of everything. And if the foundation isn't solid, everything built on top of it is not solid either.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. It's been a pleasure having you here today and teaching us a little bit about data and why it's so important.
So, well, thank you guys for having me. And if anybody ever needs any of our environmental data, they can always shoot us an email at data@edwardsaquifer.org. It's just simple enough, data@edwardsaquifer.org. We can get you the data that you need.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bryan.
Not a problem. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.